I want you guys to do something for me, and I want you guys to think of some of your favorite franchises. Whether it's movies, TV shows, video games, books, whatever it is, I want you to think about why you like that franchise. Was it because of the great characters, the beautiful effects, the story being told? We all have favorite stories that drew our imaginations and captured our hearts in different ways. There are lots of franchises to choose from, but for me, one of the best examples of this is Star Trek. Star Trek was a series that made me think about what it means to be alive. It offered a unique blend of action, philosophy, and character relationships. Star Trek is a show that has pioneered and set the bar for being a show that looks positively on mankind itself. The franchise focuses itself on what mankind could be, and it helps us all imagine a future that humanity could be proud of. This is the vision that sets Star Trek apart from other great franchises like Star Wars or the MCU. The relationship I have with Star Wars is completely different than the relationship I have with Star Trek. While Star Trek is focused on being a series focused on what mankind could be, Star Wars is focused more on the values of family and self-identity. Understanding who you are is a major portion of the Star Wars universe, whether it's from Luke in the original trilogy, Anakin in the prequels, Ahsoka in the Clone Wars, or Kylo Ren in the sequels. The difference in these themes is what separates these shows. They have different goals. But recently, Star Trek seems to be losing its sense of identity. The wondrous optimism of what mankind can strive to be has been replaced with generic sci-fi tropes. Whatever happened to trying to better ourselves, to diplomacy, and trying to treat others with respect? What happened to the idea that humanity isn't a bunch of assholes and we'll work past our problems and eventually unite? These themes and questions have left this once great franchise, and I just don't know how. Where did we fall off track? What happened to Star Trek? Well, to understand, we first need to look at where we came from. The golden era of Star Trek pretty much began when Star Trek itself first began with the original series in 1966. And while fans have had different dates on when the glory days ended, I think most can say it ended around 2005 with Enterprise. So for almost 40 years, it was the golden age for Star Trek fans. The original series began and got the series rolling. Many people had never watched anything like the original series, and it was something to behold. For its time, the original series was a pioneer for television for special effects, writing, and just storytelling in general. It even broke records and was just a really cool series overall. It had interesting characters like Bones, Scotty, Aurora, and of course Spock and Riker. This cast and the stories they told are what makes this show what it is. The character of James Kirk was not only well written, but inspiring. For many years, this man embodied heroism, truth, and in some ways the American way. He leads the Enterprise through the unknown and explores the universe. He wasn't afraid of anything. He pushed through and led the best way he knew how. And after the series, we got the movies. The first movie was just Star Trek the Motion Picture. But afterwards we got Wrath of Khan, which I think was the real kicker for Star Trek. Wrath of Khan is one of the most iconic Star Trek movies and probably considered the best. It has a terrifying villain and an interesting plot that pushes it forward. The show understood how to build friendship dynamics and interactions that were all meaningful. It was great at having moments of characters that are extremely meaningful, and these interactions would continue into the following films. One of the best examples of this is in Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, an argument between Spock and Kirk.
But you know how I feel about this. They're animals, Jim.
There is an historic opportunity here.
Don't believe them. Don't trust them.
They are dying.
Let them die. Has it occurred to you that this crew is due to stand down in 3 months? We've done our bit for king and country. You should have trusted me.
This tension between the two is a great way of displaying these two's friendship. Kirk's hatred of the Klingons, Spock's logical and diplomatic response, and a position Spock is putting Kirk in. This dynamic is permeating itself throughout the series and movies for them. Even in movies or episodes where the plot and pacing is off, these characters are always on par. The show never forgets what it is about. The show never deviates from its open dialogue.
The Starship Enterprise. Its 5-year mission: to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations, to boldly go where no man has gone before.
It knows that they are explorers and interests of exploring the universe. This show knows the meaning of being a pioneer and embraces it. It isn't afraid of taking risks or having tough conversations and having its characters learn and grow. That's the testament of a good show. A show that can balance this dilemma between want and the need in the conflict. The Star Trek in the original series may not be perfect, but it was a great way to introduce the franchise to this world. It was a great way to show us this universe and these characters. The movies help develop this world and explore different aspects of it that can be developed in further movies and spin-offs. So after the show ended in 1969, fans had Star Trek movies, and they waited. They waited for a new show to arrive, and after 18 years in September 1987, Star Trek The Next Generation came out, and oh boy, did it change Star Trek forever. TNG started a new crew for the Enterprise and was set a few years ahead of the original series, and what this show started would change Star Trek forever. Unlike the original series, TNG changed its formula and made each episode much more meaningful. It wasn't afraid of telling inspiring messages, unique stories, and compelling narratives all at the same time. Star Trek hasn't been this good since TNG. While close, it was never to this level. Picard, in my eyes, is not only one of the best Star Trek characters of all time, but one of the best written characters. He is consistent and always loyal. He has struggles and always feels like a real person. You understand where he is coming from and want him to succeed. But most of all, he is a prime example of what every man should strive to be. He's brave, wise, courageous, and inspiring. One of the big differences between the original series and The Next Generation is the crew themselves. Picard is completely different from Kirk. They both have completely different styles of running their ship. Picard is much more seasoned than Kirk and spends most of his time teaching his crew and others the lessons they will need to learn one day. He's similar to Jed Bartlett from The West Wing. He's determined, focused, and knows what needs to be done. He isn't perfect, but his intentions all come out of a singular purpose of being good. His pride can often be his downfall, but he's never afraid to get back up. Picard is an excellent character who, unlike Kirk, has to fight to educate and to accomplish peace. Kirk was often rambunctious, energetic, and would let his emotions dictate his actions. He was always loyal to his crew, was smart enough to learn, and was an invaluable friend to his crew. And this is exactly how First Officer William T. Riker is in the beginning of the show. Riker is a lot like Kirk in the first season of TNG, acting brash, getting with the ladies, and being the stud of the ship. But Riker learns from Picard to be more of a mindful leader, to be eager, but to also be cautious of the journey that awaits them. Learning to be less of a fighter and a lover, and more of a leader. Riker's transformation is incredible throughout this show. When you first see him in Season 1 to how you see him in even Season 4, and how he reflects upon himself with this other commander, is a great example of showing his growth, of how he's become more patient and more of a leader overall.
And more.
Then we can throw away the visor.
I don't think so, sir. Price is a little too high for me. And I don't like who I'd have to thank.
Commander, you and I need to have a conversation.
You never ordered me not to discuss this with the captain.
You disagree with me, fine. You need to take it to the captain, fine. Through me. You do an end run around me again, I'll snap you back so hard you'll think you're a first-year cadet again.
May I speak frankly, sir?
By all means.
You're in my way.
Really? How terrible for you.
Commander Data is a really interesting character in this show because of the innocence that he has with the rest of the crew. His ability to be extremely knowledgeable yet gullible makes him a fantastic character to explore.
I've never heard the word Takan before.
Understandable. It has been extinct for 600,000 of our years. These planets were once outposts of that empire.
Data, what are you doing?
Apologies, Captain. I seem to have reached an odd functional impasse. I am stuck.
Data doesn't judge, he doesn't treat anyone badly based on emotion. He is, for the most part, a neutral character, and his relationship with the rest of the crew is fantastic. This is where I'm just going to talk about the crew entirely for a while, because the show has full episodes just dedicated to focusing on these characters and their lives. They aren't afraid to show you Data's musical recital, Wesley's final exams, Worf's birthday, O'Brien's wedding, and more. The characters in this show exist on the Enterprise. They aren't worried about the next big threat because there isn't only going to be big threats in the universe. Sometimes characters do the most learning while reenacting a Sherlock Holmes book on the holodeck, or by having lunch together in 10 Forward. These slow moments are beautiful and separate TNG from most shows. I compare this show with West Wing a lot because of the way it treats its characters. West Wing would have episodes fully devoted to them and learning why they feel a certain way or learning about themselves. The experience of these characters is extraordinary. This doesn't mean that the characters don't get their world-ending moments, though. In fact, some of the best episodes center around this due to it not being a regular thing. The fact that there isn't a ship-ending threat every episode makes the ones that do come more meaningful. Less is more. Episodes like The Best of Both Worlds Part 1 and 2, or Q Who, are great heavy-stake plots that affect the show, and Starfleet as a whole drastically. And they hit this hard because we let it build to it properly. We have interesting characters who drove the plot forward, and in episodes like Deja Q, while they do have consequences for the ship that are severe, they also are just filled with small moments that give Data and Q welcome moments of delight. This is what we talk about when Star Trek fans talk about the glory days of Star Trek. We talk about these moments of characters living their lives, to ship threats being engaged full, to having complicated choices and ideas thrown at us. This show is the pinnacle of what Star Trek is because it embodies everything that Star Trek is supposed to be. Complicated topics, great characters, interesting stories, all things that Star Trek was known for. These things are even amplified more in The Next Generation than they were from the original trilogy, which did a good job to that on its own. So having a show that amplifies this even more is extremely impressive. And this is why Star Trek is the franchise that it is. This show is the Empire Strikes Back of the Star Trek universe, and it pushes this franchise far above what anyone else anticipated. And after that, it got a spin-off show while different from TNG, and it focused a lot on the good aspects of Star Trek. These would be known as Deep Space Nine and Voyager. I don't want to focus too long on Deep Space Nine or Voyager because most of the aspects that make these shows great are the same aspects that make TNG great. These three shows are all siblings in my eyes, and they share similar traits while being different. So I'm going to focus on the things that make these shows different from TNG. Deep Space Nine changes the Star Trek formula. This isn't just in the fact that they're not exploring the universe like Enterprise is, but the biggest difference lies with the crew of Deep Space Nine themselves. The characters that inhabit the space station are similar to those on TNG, and some are even from that show in general. But the characters in DS9 make different decisions. While TNG focuses on struggling with making the correct decisions, DS9 focuses on what happens when you don't make those decisions. A good example of this is the difference between Captains Picard and Sisko. Picard is known for being the moral center of the show for TNG. His decision making and the wisdom he gives is used to better not just the ship members but the audience as well. But Sisko, he makes decisions that aren't always correct, especially in the beginning. He is fierce, determined, and bitter, and these attributes affect his decision making. You'll see Sisko make choices that Picard wouldn't because of that. You see the consequences of those actions. You see what happens when you don't prioritize the greater good, focus on your ego, and more of this with Sisko. Characters like O'Brien and Worf act differently around this character because unlike Picard, who keeps him in check with his morality, Sisko doesn't all the time, and this affects the people around him. What's important to note though is that you still like Sisko because he learns from these mistakes and gets better as the show goes on. Sisko is learning to be a better captain and a better person as time goes on. He becomes less bitter and learns to care more as the show goes on, and it makes his journey much more satisfying. Jadzia is one of my favorite characters in the show. Her energy is always up, and she is a beacon that a lot of characters lean on in this show. Her energy and atmosphere is always up, and it makes the show so much more fun. This energy and atmosphere is what makes Star Trek so cool. Voyager, while it doesn't break the formula like Deep Space Nine, it pushes the character growth and moments the same as TNG. This show is the weakest out of these three in my opinion, but it still has very good moments. Characters like 7 and 9 are important because of the impact and development they have on the Star Trek universe, but also the relatability that they have. Having someone with such a tragic background learn to care about a new family is incredibly touching. And then you have just characters like Catherine Janeway, who is a great captain in the show. She's a character who makes similar decisions as Captain Picard, but with the personality more of Pike and Riker. She's adventurous and exciting, but also isn't afraid of a little danger every now and then. She's a fantastic character that was a great leader for the show. Overall, these two shows were solid and helped push the franchise forward. While these two shows weren't as solid as The Next Generation, you bet that they were great shows and they knew what their audience and fan base wanted. They didn't pander to the audience but told interesting stories in the world they lived in. Both these shows pushed the ideals of Star Trek forward and kept its name well preserved. This is a trait that future Star Trek shows and movies would struggle with from here on out. From here on out, things get a little shaky. Enterprise is where you could say the golden era for Star Trek stops, if we're being honest. When looking at Enterprise, a lot of people look at Enterprise as the first sign of the decline for the Star Trek universe. And while out of all the shows we talked about so far, it's probably the weakest, I also think its core foundation is solid. Enterprise is a show that has a lot of things that are going well for Star Trek. It has a great cast of characters, an inspiring captain, a great premise, good effects, and more of the above. But where the show falters is more of a product of its time. Enterprise was released in that era where shows were extremely cutthroat. The show was taking its time to build its audience and fan base, but by the time it was starting to get the hang of it, it was cancelled. The show also struggled with its audience because it was trying to do too many things at once and trying to be too different from previous Star Trek shows. Unlike the other show's intros, Enterprise intro had a pop song played in the background instead of the classical orchestral theme that it's usually known for.
I will touch the sky, and they're not gonna hold me down no more. No, they're not gonna change my mind, 'cause I've got faith of the heart. I'm going where my heart will take me. I've got faith to believe.
This, along with the show trying to be more sexual for no real reason and breaking canon for the first time in the franchise's history, were all big shockwaves that surprised the community. Despite the great characters and interesting story, the show never fully grabbed me and took me on a wild journey like the others did. Now, with everything said, Enterprise is still Star Trek. The feeling of discovery, adventure, and unity were all present in the show. The spirit of Star Trek still exists in it, even if it has weak points, unlike some shows we'll be coming across. So, that's pretty much it, guys. We talked about the golden era of Star Trek. This era was significant for the franchise. From the OG series to Enterprise, Star Trek was an adventurous franchise of great shows and decent movies. We had shows like The Next Generation that pushed our imagination and asked us deep questions about who we are and what we should be. Shows like Deep Space Nine showed us the consequences of actions and how we could make our lives. And then we had shows like Voyager and Enterprise, which show us the overall existence of just exploring the stars. And while all of this is great, from here on out, we enter a new phase of Star Trek. Now, before we talk about this new phase, I want to bring something up that I think is important to the Star Trek franchise. And that is, I think Star Trek itself is better in a TV format than a movie format. Star Trek is at its best when you can see the characters evolve and learn over time, when it's able to explore different morals, messages, and themes over the course of time. What is it like when a captain breaks a moral code of his? When your back is tied against a wall? What do you do when you have unlimited power, and what does that really mean? These are all the philosophies that the original series explored. And while the movies can explore these messages, they are fleshed out better in a TV format, because of you being able to see the costs this can have over time. You get to spend a lot of time with the characters and are able to see them develop and learn into who they're supposed to be. Having an episode where Data fails to win a video game doesn't work well in a movie, but it is brilliant in a TV show where the more down-to-earth stories can be told, and in doing so, become more powerful than the world and the threats that we face in the movies.
And Commander, it is possible to commit no mistakes and still lose. That is not a weakness. That is life.
I believe I understand, sir.
And Data, will you leave your hesitation and self-doubt here in your quarters?
In the end, I think Star Trek movies are fun and enjoyable. They're bits of Star Trek. But the true glory of Star Trek is explored on the screen across from your couch. So as we enter this new phase, let's keep this in mind as we start a new journey. After Enterprise, nothing is the same. From this point on, we're about to enter the new era of Star Trek. And this all started in 2009 with J.J. Abrams' Star Trek. This new era of Star Trek that we're about to enter, it has its highs and it has its lows. But no matter what part we're in of this new era, it has never felt like the way that Next Gen has made me feel, or the way that Voyager or any of the previous shows have. And that's because they're missing core values. The core values of what makes Star Trek great. So with all that, let's start talking about Star Trek 2009. Alright, so let's get some context for this movie. This movie is directed by J.J. Abrams. The last Star Trek movie we got happened 7 years ago, and the way that movie ended kind of put the characters and everything else to bed. We want to create a new Star Trek movie that's more modern and is focused on reintroducing characters. It has to be a movie that new audience members can watch, but also has to please Trek fans as well. That's a lot to do in a single film, and a lot of pressure. So in order to do this, they got J.J. Abrams, who was becoming extremely popular at the time, and one of the things he really emphasized on is that he was never a huge Star Trek fan.
When I was a kid, I never liked Star Trek when I was a kid. Growing up, I always thought it was, honestly, I couldn't get into it. My friends loved it, and I would try, and I'd watch episodes, but it always felt too philosophical for me. And we tried to, some of the writers love Star Trek. I was not really a fan. My producing partner never saw it. Right. So when we were all happy, it felt like that was the way to go. And this movie that we did, the goal was to make a movie for moviegoers, not just for Star Trek fans. Right. So if you've never seen Star Trek before, you can see this movie.
We'll get back to this later, and he even got advice from George Lucas on how to make the film better overall. So the '09 Star Trek film is different from any other Star Trek film at the time because it was made with a different intent behind it. While other Star Trek films focus on intelligent dialogue and interesting conflicts to push the story forward, this film focuses on being a more modern action film than the others. Sometimes it does this really well. The first introduction to the film is spectacular. It is focused and delivers interesting ramifications for characters that we have yet to see.
If I don't report in 15 minutes, evacuate the crew.
Sir, we can
There is no help for us out here. Use autopilot. And get off the ship.
Aye, Captain.
You're captain now, Mr. Kirk.
The intensity behind the actions and the music are all perfect. Where this doesn't work as well as when you have characters making brash choices or decisions that they probably wouldn't make under normal circumstances, and it becomes a problem because sometimes they'll just begin to act dumb for the sake of the plot. Overall though, I think this movie is great. It is a solid film that does what it can with what it's got. The film is primarily focused on the original series crew, but this time they're younger and something major has happened. Right as James Kirk is being born, his father is killed by a Romulan ship that has traveled from the future.
George, the shuttle's leaving. Where are you?
Sweetheart, listen to me. I'm not gonna be there.
No.
This is the only way you'll survive.
Please stay on the ship. You have to be here.
The shuttles will never make it if I don't fight them off.
George, I can't do this without you.
This causes a new timeline to form, and in this timeline, James is more of a freelance character. He rebels more and never had that father figure to really teach him the morals that he has in the original series. Here, he finds that father figure in character Captain Pike, who begins to teach him things that he needs to learn to become a true Starfleet officer. I really like this because it gives us different takes on a character that we've seen before and changes his narrative in a bit.
So your dad dies, you can settle for less than ordinary life. Or do you feel like you were meant for something better? Something special? Enlist in Starfleet. Your father was captain of a starship for 12 minutes.
He saved 800 lives, including your mother's and yours.
I dare you to do better.
The way Kirk is brought up in this film is different and it's interesting. The rest of the cast, Aurora, Bones, Scotty, and Spock, are all pretty similar to their former selves, with the exception of Spock, who is more emotional in this movie than in the series. What this movie does extremely well is giving us a faster paced action film that still keeps true to most of the principles of Star Trek. It doesn't have deep lessons for us to learn, but it does have an adventurous young spirit with it. It can build towards these attributes by giving the characters growth over time, and having them learn this lifestyle as time goes on. This movie is setting the groundwork for these attributes and does a good job at it. There are moments in the film that aren't developed enough that could have been fixed with some writing changes and pacing issues. Several scenes could be cut, trimmed, or rewritten to be more efficient, and to use that screen time for more character development. I've noticed these issues tend to pop up in Abrams' movies though. The best moments in the film, though, are where they are setting up for greatness. Older Spock is a great example of this movie being a good setup movie. The way old Spock handles younger characters is fascinating because he knows the potential this group has and the friendships that will arrive because of it. His conversations with himself is a great example of this.
Then why did you send Kirk aboard when you alone could have explained the truth?
Because you needed each other. I could not deprive you of the revelation of all that you could accomplish together, of a friendship that will define you both in ways you cannot yet realize.
Overall, Star Trek 2009 is a great way to restart this franchise, and while it has issues, it still holds on the original spirit of Star Trek and what it stands for. And this is why it's a good Star Trek film. This film is a good way to ease new people into the concepts of Star Trek. It has the cast and it has the original spirit of what Star Trek is, but it doesn't dive straight into those deep questions. And that's something that the sequels could spend time doing to really help develop the franchise and help push it forward and making sure that it is a well-paced and a well-thought-out trilogy. I'm not going to go into too much more detail of this film because a lot has already been said about it. It is old now, and so let's talk about the next film, which I have a lot more to say on. Star Trek Into Darkness is an interesting film in this trilogy because of the power it holds. Star Trek 09 is focused on reintroducing these characters to you, but Into Darkness is where these films show you who these characters are going to become. Are they going to develop into the characters we know from the original series, or do they take a different path? This film tries to do both in a sense. The film shows the Enterprise and its crew continuing doing small missions and adventures for Starfleet. However, due to Kirk's recklessness, he breaks the Prime Directive in order to save Spock's life. This event triggers Pike to demote Kirk and to make him first officer. Before Kirk and Pike can set out, Pike is killed, and Kirk gets permission from Admiral Marcus to go after the man who killed Pike. He gives 72 special torpedoes and tells him to go blow him up. Kirk and his team go out to take out this ruthless maniac who killed Pike, but when the Enterprise engines breaks down, Kirk decides to go get the man himself instead and take him prisoner. When Kirk and his team go to capture the man, he easily beats them, but when he hears there's exactly 72 torpedoes, he surrenders. After we learn this man's name is Khan and how he is a superhuman and his crew members have been stashed inside the 72 torpedoes of the Enterprise. At this moment, the admiral who told Kirk to go kill Khan shows up and turns out to be an admiral who's pretty much lost his mind and is extremely evil. He tries to kill the Enterprise, and isn't until Kirk and Khan sneak on board the ship that they are able to stop the admiral. That is, until Khan kills him and betrays Kirk. But Spock ultimately outsmarts Khan and blows up the ship. The movie ends with Kirk dying in a similar way to how Spock dies in Wrath of Khan, and Spock goes to kill Khan. But Khan has super blood, and they are able to bring Kirk back to life and to stop Khan. Kirk and his team then get chosen for a 5-year mission to explore space for the next 5 years, and it ends with a similar tone to how the original series begins. The end. The biggest character moments in this movie are focused on Jim and Spock's relationship. Throughout the film, Jim is having a hard time getting Spock to connect to him the same way that he does. Throughout the film, both Kirk and Aurora are trying to get Spock to just reach out more, but Spock reveals he doesn't want to open himself up to emotions again because of the rage he felt when his mother died.
Not exactly a love song, Spock.
You misunderstand. It is true I chose not to feel anything upon realizing that my own life was ending. As Admiral Pike was dying, I joined with his consciousness and experienced what he felt at the moment of his passing. Anger, confusion, loneliness, fear.
I had experienced those feelings before, multiplied exponentially on the day my planet was destroyed. Such a feeling is something I choose never to experience again.
This moment between the three is quite good, and Zachary Levi does a great job performing it. And throughout the film, Chris Pine is doing his best in this film as Kirk. Unlike the last film, where there were a few moments where I felt like Kirk and Spock weren't acting like themselves, I always felt like I was watching Spock and Kirk in this movie. The actors are doing a fantastic job portraying these characters. This movie does a great job in bringing Khan into focus as a villain. He is brought up slowly throughout the film with dialogue of his own. It is mainly from other people that we learn about him until he reveals himself from Kirk. The scene with him, Bones, Spock, and Kirk is great, and it's quite scary to see this antagonist in this film. Khan feels threatening.
I looked up John Harrison. Until a year ago, he didn't exist.
John Harrison was a fiction created the moment I was awoken by your Admiral Marcus to help him advance his cause.
A smokescreen to conceal my true identity. My name is Khan.
Why would a Starfleet admiral ask a 300-year-old frozen man for help?
Because I am better.
At what?
Everything.
Another part of the film that I thought was great was Kirk's lack of faith in himself. Halfway through, Kirk's self-confidence falters, and he believes the only way to stop the Admiral is to just take Khan with him to board the ship. But the truth is, he's lost faith in his ability to command the ship, and he doesn't think he'll be a good captain.
What I'm about to do, it doesn't make any sense. It's not logical. It is a gut feeling. I have no idea what I'm supposed to do. I only know what I can do. The Enterprise and her crew need someone in that chair that knows what he's doing. And it's not me. It's you, Spock.
I think this choice of self-doubt is a great way to prepare himself for his overall redemption. He sacrifices himself to save the Enterprise, and this movie has a strong moment where before he dies, Kirk and Spock have an interaction. They both talk about the tactics they used on Khan and how they acted the way they thought the other would. It's a great way to see these characters interact incredibly well. It also concludes these two struggle with connecting with each other by having them step into each other's shoes. It really lets them understand each other. Where this film begins to falter, though, is in one major part, the second to third act. While the first act takes its time establishing the villain, the plot, the end towards the second act into the third is where this movie begins to have trouble with the writing. There are great elements in this movie. An admiral who is focused on war that isn't here yet, an egotist who is focused on getting his family back, a duo working on communicating to each other. It's all great, but some of these end up where you can really see the cracks of them. Admiral Marcus is an interesting character, and his determination to plan tactically for a war that isn't here is fascinating, but it falls apart when you realize that he's actually just psychotic. The Admiral sets up the Enterprise and sabotages them so they would all die, all to cover up a mistake he made. He was going to murder literally thousands of people and wasn't going to lose a nickel slave because of it. This immediately makes him a character who you have no sympathy for whatsoever. But the movie wants you to think that he's a man who's just made a mistake and lost his way. And this is clear when his daughter is being introduced. She tries to plead to him about the father she knows and how he wouldn't kill all these people, but we've never seen this guy before. He wasn't in the last movie. This movie hasn't shown us him before, and now he's just a mustache twirling villain. It doesn't give any explanation of why he's acting this way, and it loses all sympathy with him when he just becomes a mustache twirling villain. This could have been avoided with the Admiral not intending to kill the Enterprise and actually liking Kirk. Having them have a small relationship and grow their trust together makes his betrayal that much more effective. And if we see him struggle with deciding that the only way to kill Khan is to blow up the Enterprise, it would be a great improvement because of the conflict it brings. And the Admiral doesn't want to kill people but feels he has to save more lives, and it's just much more compelling. He becomes less of a psychotic maniac who thinks he's the king of Starfleet, and becomes an older man who went too far with his measures to protect his country. That's one example of this movie struggling with its writing. It had a great idea, but it went to extreme with its concepts. Another interesting idea is having a new character like Carol Marcus. While adding a new character like Carol Marcus is a good idea in theory, it isn't executed right here. Having Carol being introduced is great because she can be different perspectives for people, she has a personality that's different, and she's pretty smart and is valuable to the Enterprise. She can help bounce ideas off of Spock and Kirk in a way that Aurora and Bones really can't. Where this falters is the fact that she isn't developed as an actual person. We know little about Carol overall. We know she's feisty and afraid to break the rules, but we don't know why she cares for the Enterprise. Her relationship with her father, or really anything with that fact, is all we know about her. She's just here as a plot device for the story, which is fine, except for they treat her like she's one of the main characters, because she is one of the main characters in the original series. And it is clear they're setting her up in the next movie, but this film's importance with her isn't well defined. The worst scene in the movie with her perfectly encapsulates her problem. It feels out of place and has no real benefit to the movie overall. The movie also has certain weak plot points like a war with the Klingons, Khan's entire crew, or the superhuman blood being pushed aside without being properly addressed. At the end of the film, the Enterprise is chosen to go on a 5-year mission to just exploring and seeking out new life. It ends in a way that you would think the TV show would start, which is pretty cool. Except for the fact that there's supposedly a war with the Klingons about to happen, and we're sending people out to explore? Wouldn't you want every ship nearby in case you went to war, especially your flagship? Also, why do we have to fear death now? Like, we have a literal cure for death. Like, a vaccine to cure death has been invented, and this plot point is never addressed. And it's really irritating because you're trying to enjoy this movie, like, you want to enjoy it, but then it has these moments where the logic just falls apart. These plot holes make the movie annoying to watch when you're really paying attention. It feels like the movie uses the sci-fi trope of, well, it's the future, so we can do anything, which is just a cheap card to play. But regardless of the plot errors in this movie, I think they're acceptable. If you turn off your brain just a little bit, it allows you to enjoy this film a lot more. And the reason this is acceptable is because of the overall results and message of this movie. This movie is focused on the characters of the Enterprise growing into their roles. Kirk learning what it means to be captain, Spock learning to break the rules, Sulu learning to have more confidence, and more. This film, while it has a lot of action and a messy plot, it's focused on these characters learning what it means to be a member of a starship together. They learn how to iron out the wrinkles and to be a crew that just works amazingly with each other. This is awesome. Having scenes like this really helps bring the movie together. First movie sets up who the characters are, and the second movie focuses on the characters understanding who they want to be. We heard in the first movie that old Spock told Kirk that he was destined to be captain, but we don't see what that really means until the end of this movie. This natural progression of these movies is what makes them good. They're fun, but their faithful duty to these characters is prioritized above all else, just like in the original series and in Star Trek Next Generation. So the only thing that would make these movies better is if you created a less messy plot and focused more on characters having to overcome their obstacles in a unique way, less punching and more creative solutions. Having Kirk learn the political aspect of his job, defeating people through debate and rules. These could be interesting new challenges for Kirk and Spock to learn, and would hammer home the concept of Starfleet and their desire to do good. The third movie is where the trilogy can really do the trick with the concept of exploring and bettering ourselves. So does it? Star Trek Beyond is the only movie in this trilogy to not be directed by J.J. Abrams. Abrams, you have got to learn to finish a complete trilogy for a change. Anyway, this film was directed by Justin Lin, the director of the Fast and Furious films. With that information, let's go over the plot of this film. Beyond is set 3 years after the Enterprise has started their 5-year journey. 3 years in, and Kirk has started to get tired of the position and is wanting to transfer out. Meanwhile, old Spock has died, and in order to continue his own legacy, Spock is going to resign from the Enterprise and help his people. Before the two can tell each other this, a survivor from a destroyed ship asks for help, and Starfleet sends the Enterprise. The Enterprise goes to help the crew that got lost in this nebula, and as they do, they are attacked. The aliens that attack them destroy the Enterprise, having the entire crew abandon the ship to this planet. Eventually, with the help of an alien named Jayla, they are able to save the remaining 20 members of the Enterprise and get to an old abandoned starship called the Franklin. They use the Franklin to escape the planet and stop the leader of the aliens named Kroll from destroying his space station. It is also revealed that Kroll was a former Starfleet captain and used plot devices to stay alive for hundreds of years. In the end, Kroll is defeated, and Kirk and Spock decide that they should remain on the Enterprise. The end. Beyond is different than the rest of the films in this trilogy. This is because of the intent behind it. Lin put an effort to go back to basics with this film. It takes time building relationships with characters we haven't seen interact a whole lot with. Kirk and Chekhov, Uhura and Sulu, Spock and Bones. these characters are separated early in the film and are partnered together. The chemistry these actors and the characters have is well done, especially with Spock and Bones. Some of the best moments of the movie are these two just talking to each other.
Okay. All right, Spock. I just got one question. What's your favorite color?
I fail to see the relevance.
Yeah, they say it hurts less if it's a surprise.
If I may adopt a parlance with which you are familiar, I can confirm your theory to be horse shit.
This film also introduces new characters like Krall and Jayla. Jayla is a character who I thought overall was quite enjoyable. Her personality and role in the story is quite generic. She is a survivor of the main villain and escaped captivity since she was a young girl, and ever since she's been working to get her revenge. Not the most unique character, but fun regardless. The problem I have with her will be revealed in a minute. Krall, on the other hand, is without a doubt the worst villain in this trilogy. Unlike Nero or Khan, who are given justified motivations in the beginning or middle part of their movies, Krall isn't given any reasoning for his actions until the end. And the end is that he is old and crazy. The foundations of Krall's character are interesting. An ex-Starfleet captain who wants revenge on the organization that abandoned him is a pretty cool concept. The problem is that we don't learn this until the last 30 minutes of the movie, and by this point, Krall has lost any interest we may have for him. If Krall's motivations and points had been established in the middle portion of the movie when we met Sulu and Uhura, it would have been fleshed out a lot better, I think. This film also addresses one of the complaints about Abrams' first two movies, which was that they were more focused on action than the message being told. His movie does tell a message, but delivers it clumsily. Understanding who you are, but be willing to change. That's this movie's thesis. Kirk is focused on trying to understand who he is, and seems to have lost his identity over the 3 years of being in space. But after fighting Krall and seeing his failure of protecting the Enterprise, he learns that he can never be stagnant. He has to protect those who are in need of it, and learn to change. So, here's the problem. Kirk has already learned the value of protecting those in need and learning how to evolve. He learned that message into darkness. So to rehash this theme for Kirk by having him doubt himself again makes him seem insecure and not ready to be captain. This also goes for Spock, who believes his greatest accomplishments are serving his people once Spock has died. But he has already been told that the good that he can do is on the Enterprise. With Kirk. We are rehashing old themes that we've already spent time with, and it makes this movie feel redundant at best. The other aspects is that we aren't given much time with the other characters of the Enterprise. This is an issue that I didn't mention, but it happens in all three movies. The crew of the Enterprise, besides Bones, Spock, and Kirk, are not really fleshed out well. Sulu has a few exceptions, but besides that, it's not even close. Scotty is probably the closest, with Uhura not far behind. The other characters aren't given a whole lot of time to fully develop and to come into their own. Also, where is Carol Danvers in this movie? Anyway. This movie makes a point in establishing a more lifestyle environment on the Enterprise, which I really like. It shows us their daily routines, the relationships they built, and so forth. However, this is all just used to make you feel bad for the Enterprise when it is blown up, and you see everyone here dies. This could have been used to develop Sulu, Chekhov, and Uhura as more fully fleshed characters. The dynamic that Spock and Bones have is great, and seeing the interaction that the others could have would have been just as good. The mishandling of these characters is disappointing because this movie is trying to be an original Star Trek movie, but it doesn't want to take the time to develop to the characters. It's telling a theme that we learned in the last movie, and it doesn't really have the overall cool, grasping messages that Star Trek is even known for. And then to top it all off, the action in this movie is worse than the previous two. So it ends up just kind of feeling redundant, because it's not better than the previous two, because it's telling an old theme, and it's not better than the originals because the themes it is telling don't feel relevant. So it makes this movie really hard to enjoy sometimes. When I was talking about Star Trek 09 and Into Darkness, I mentioned how the first film reintroduced the characters, and the second film helped those characters grow into their roles. And now the third film is having them grow into their roles even more. It just feels redundant. This movie should have progressed these characters' relationship with each other, and it could have them teach others these lessons as well. Towards the end of Beyond, Kirk attempts to teach Krall the message of learning to evolve and how you can't keep fighting the same battles over and over again. It's a good thing for a character like Krall to learn, and for someone like Kirk, it is a good lesson for him to teach. The problem is that this wasn't a lesson Kirk had to learn in any of the previous movies, and he doesn't impart wisdom in this film until the last 20 minutes. This film should have had him and the Enterprise trying to teach others the powers of negotiation and debate, the real tools for conflicts to be resolved. Because a war doesn't solve Krall's problems permanently. So this message would have been perfect for Krall to learn and for Kirk to teach. But any message in this film does have, it gets drowned in its own confusing plots. This film doesn't develop the characters enough, it doesn't have a clean focus, and it feels almost redundant overall. Which is impressive because a lot happens in this film. The Enterprise blows up, and almost the entire crew dies, and yet not much feels like it happens because of how it played out. This film feels the weakest out of the trilogy due to its inability to be able to focus on the right messages and to do a quick enough pace. It has good intentions and a good foundation, but it falters in the end. I like the attempts that this movie makes to be more like classic Star Trek. The character moments that it does have, like I said, with Spock and Bones is very well done. Chekhov and Kirk are a great pairing, and having these characters be together is actually pretty cool. And if it wasn't for the dumb plot that put these characters in their situation, or if it wasn't for the bad action, or if it wasn't for the message that we're already learning, it would actually have been a really cool film. Krall is a great villain if you set him up early on in the film, and you don't need all this confusing plot lines to get him to be there. In the end, it feels more like classic Star Trek, but it's a sloppier one that isn't developed all the way, and it almost feels like a fan fiction. Before we wrap up this movie, I do want to just say overall that I do think it's not like the worst Star Trek movie of all time. Right? It's not that bad. Why I get upset with this movie is because it had the potential to be like the new Wrath of Khan in a sense. It had the potential to be one of the best Star Trek movies, and it just missed it by a few key points. Because like the things I'm talking about, like I said, they can change pretty easily. They could have changed with small adjustments, but they didn't. And that's why I get upset with it. So, after analyzing the whole trilogy of Star Trek films, I think it's safe to say that the majority of these films are good. They're fun action films that hold core principles of Star Trek and the characters it's serving justice to. It isn't focused on telling too complicated of a message, but keeping it on the characters and the growth that we see. The overall feel of this trilogy is of a younger, less experienced Star Trek that has yet to really grown into its own all the way. It's sad to see it ends on a low note, but however, the adventure continues. So, going into this deep dive of Star Trek, there were two shows I had not watched all the way. I never watched Discovery, and I hadn't finished Picard. So, I started with the Chris Pine trilogy, and afterwards would move to Discovery. I was told a lot of things about Discovery. I was told that the writing was bad, the characters weren't fleshed out, and that the overall, it just didn't feel like Star Trek. And while that would deter some people, it would not deter one such as myself. So I bravely got in my chair, I got on my dad's Paramount Plus account, and began to watch Discovery. And what I encountered was worse than I could have ever imagined. So before we go into Discovery though, I do want to talk about the things I did like. This isn't the worst show ever made, and there's got to be some benefits and aspects to it that got me on board. So what are they? I liked Harry Mudd, played by Rainn Wilson. Okay, let's get to the bad things. Discovery is one of the worst shows I have ever watched, and that doesn't deserve to even have the Star Trek name and its pathetic excuse of a show, because it doesn't have any aspects that make Star Trek great. There was literally no aspect of the show that felt like Star Trek except for the names. If you swap the names of the different organizations, planets, and races, you would think this was a poor Star Trek ripoff. So no, I will not be putting Star Trek's name in this God-forbidden show. This show is Discovery. So let's talk about Discovery and why I am so pissed off about it. Season 1 of Discovery is focused on a first officer named Michael Burnham. When there is a random object floating in space, Burnham goes to explore it and finds out it's a Klingon probe of sorts, and accidentally kills a Klingon in the process. This inadvertently starts a war with the Klingons, and thinking she can save the ship, Burnham starts a mutiny with her captain, but gets taken down and is court-martialed. After her captain dies, of course. So 6 months later, the war is still going, and Burnham is recruited to work on a Discovery, which conveniently has a couple of her old crew members on board so she can feel the shame and humiliation. Burnham joins with the captain, a first officer whose name I've refused to look up, and the chief science officer. They eventually go through a bunch of shenanigans, end of the war by the first season. Now, I'm mainly going to go over the first season of the show, and that's because the other 3 seasons of the show are just more of the same bullcrap, but they just get a little worse, and a little worse, and worse, and worse, until season 4 is just unrecognizable, and everyone agrees that this show is horrible after this point. So we're going to just focus on season 1, and focus on why this season isn't great, and why it doesn't represent Star Trek, and how that just applies to the whole show. Because I'm not going to go over the whole show, because otherwise this video will be another 40 minutes long, and we don't need that, okay? What we need is just to get to why this show is bad, and we'll move on, because I don't want to talk about this show. Please stop it. Okay, so overall, the show is focused on Burnham and her struggles of trying to find a place in Starfleet again after causing this war. The initial concept of Discovery is actually kind of interesting. A first officer who has to find her place back in Starfleet after trying to mutiny is actually kind of cool, because you don't hear of mutiny a lot in Star Trek. It's kind of an unheard of thing, so the fact that someone tried to do it is kind of a cool thing. The idea holds a lot of promise, and I like it. The problem is in the execution. To explain this mess, I'm going to start by going over the characters. I'm not going to look up these characters' names if possible, because I prefer not to remember them. So unless they're extremely important, you'll just hear me call them Generic Gay Guy 1 or Finger. No, not that Finger. Yeah, that one. Anyway, God, I hate this show. We'll start with Michael Burnham. Burnham is a character right off the bat who is conflicting. Anything about Burnham that is cool or unique is immediately followed up with a but. At first, she seems like this human who has been raised to think logically since she was adopted by Sarek. Being raised by Vulcans is a cool concept, and the idea she was raised not to be connected to her emotions is kind of a cool concept for a Starfleet officer. But they don't show this person. Burnham is extremely illogical for almost all of her actions. She is selfish and doesn't prioritize what is best for the others or the ship. She is centered on what she thinks are her best motives. Sometimes she has a moment where she is logical and methodical, and other moments she is acting like a lunatic or just an asshole for no reason. Her entire personality is dependent on what the script needs her to be. Michael's interactions with her friends are horrible as well. The first episode, we see her and the chief science officer, Finger Dude, bickering with each other. They're arguing about the data that they're reading and continuously have a type of reaction that signals that they don't like each other that much. The captain makes a joke of it not far into the first episode. This was concerning because in the very beginning of the episode, Burnham starts to talk smack to her captain when she thinks she's lost them astray. So seeing these two bicker and made me realize something. The professionalism and title of rank meant nothing to this show. It didn't matter who you were and what position you had. Anyone could argue with the captain or senior staff at any point and get no consequences. A great example of this is when Burnham asks Captain Lorca if she can go with Tyler to the Klingon ship, and he says no. Then she asks again, and he says no. Then she asks again, and just because she annoys him, he lets her go. No! A real captain would have told her to shut up and to listen to her command, and then pull her aside and let her know that if she had a problem with his orders, that she should have brought it up in private. This is basic writing that anyone who watched a single episode of TNG would understand. In TNG, there's a moment where they specifically address this issue. Commander Data is temporary captain of the Enterprise, and Worf is his second in command. Throughout the episode, Worf has made verbal comments and noises of disapproval. When the moment was right, Data brings Worf into his ready room and explains to him his concern.
Lieutenant, I am dissatisfied with your performance as first officer.
May I ask in what way?
You continually question my orders in front of the crew. I do not believe this is appropriate behavior.
With all due respect, sir, I have always felt free to voice my opinions, even when they differ from those of Captain Picard or Commander Riker.
That is true. But in those situations, you are acting as head of security, not as first officer. The primary role of the second in command is to carry out the decisions of the captain. In this case, me.
But is it not my duty to offer you alternatives?
Yes. But once I have made a decision, it is your job to carry it out, regardless of how you may personally feel. Any further objection should be given to me in private, not in front of the crew. I do not recall Commander Riker ever publicly showing irritation with his captain as you did a moment ago.
This scene is excellent because the two handle it perfectly. Both officers know their duty, but they know they have to have their place. The two's interactions is professional, but also valid. Data explains how this is important because of the role that they're in, but also because of the responsibility of being a leader on the crew. It's perfect. It's one of the big distinctions from Wesley and the rest of the crew. Wesley acts like a kid, so he argues like one as well. Over time, you see Wesley grow up to be an actual character because he goes from being a child to an officer, and he learns these responsibilities.
Go with her and make sure it gets to Commander Burnham safely.
He means in case one of us gets dead along the way.
Hurry!
I'm going. Get off my ass. Sir, get off my ass, sir.
Every officer in Discovery acts like Wesley in the beginning of the episodes of Next Generation. They're irresponsible and argue with nearly anyone who is aggressive or frightens them. The fact that the first officer and chief science officer bicker like little school children may seem like a small issue, but it is actually quite a large issue when looking at the bigger picture. When Burnham first comes on board the Discovery, the chief engineer treats her like complete trash. They do it in like an almost unworkable way. The entire process of his interactions with her are horrible. He doesn't care about her, he doesn't care about her safety, and any instant he can, he wants to belittle her. And then, like 3 episodes later, he's chill with her for no reason. It is ridiculous. Another character in the show that I hate is Tilly. Tilly is supposed to be the quirky, relatable character in the show. While everyone else is serious, mean, cold, analytical, and an idiot, Tilly is just annoying. She's supposed to be your shy and smart character who learns to stand up for herself over time. She finds an unlikely friend in Burnham, and together they'll bring the best traits out of each other. Except for the fact that Tilly is a freaking moron and a child who should not be anywhere on a starship ever. Tilly's entire character on this show is focused on her interactions with Michael, and they start to set her up as a quirky character who isn't confident, but they're just, she's trying to be. But then you learn she's actually kind of confident with stupid things. When it comes to her hitting on guys and having sex, she's pretty good at that, but when it comes to engineering and cursing at her bosses, she's also good at that. When it comes to talking to her friends, she's a complete idiot. She's like a really weird Mary Sue who's only a Mary Sue when like the camera isn't on her, and then when the camera is on her just talking to Burnham, she's a complete idiot. It is so confusing because she makes some of the dumbest decisions, and then people talk to her like they talk to her like they're in kindergarten. If I was a kid and I saw that this person was on a war vessel, I think that Starfleet was going to be killed within 2 days of the war. And then we have Tyler. Oh, Tyler. Tyler was one of the characters in the show where I didn't immediately hate him, which was a step in the right direction. He's first introduced and you think, wow, he might be some kind of traitor, but you learn he's a pretty cool dude. He escapes with Larko and they get back on the Discovery. He then builds a relationship with Burnham that makes sense, and yeah, I kind of liked it. They also reveal he has PTSD from his previous Klingon captor, and it's actually pretty interesting to see his reaction. I was like, wow, This guy actually has like character motivations. He's been through a lot. He has reasons to be in the story. I kind of like him. Until he becomes brainwashed as a puppet and we find out that he had sex with this Klingon captor. They implied that he did what he had to do to survive, and when I heard that, I thought he like volunteered to be tortured and she did some kind of brainwashing stuff on him, but not that she had sex with him. Why? This isn't Star Trek. I was so shocked by this, I immediately walked out of my room, got a tub of ice cream, ate it, and then started watching TNG to cheer me up. What messed up freak of nature thought this was a good idea? Who was it? Was it you, Brian, or Alex? I need to know. This is an abomination of Star Trek. Not because a Klingon had sex with a human, but because of the two reasons. First, don't show me this. Why? Why would you actually show me this? There is no reasoning behind it. And the second reasoning behind it is that interracial marriages and sex isn't new to Star Trek. But what it is putting dark annotations behind it. Having it be rape and showing us the horrors he went through. I mean, why is this needed? This isn't needed. It's just to be edgy. It's just to try to be, oh, this isn't your mama Star Trek. This isn't Star Trek. It's trying to be edgy. I don't understand. It is unique in being edgy. I'll give it that. It also is unique at being the worst show I've ever watched. And then the show decides to be a soap opera by having the Klingon girl have a baby. She had a baby with Tyler. The whole concept is horrible and infuriating, and that's all I am talking about with Tyler. From here on out, we are not going to mention that name ever again. I don't want to ever meet another Tyler ever again unless he's on Dude Perfect, okay? The last thing I want to talk about for Discovery is what I like to call the MacGuffin problem, or TMP as I like to call it. A TMP is any plot device or random technology that they have that lets the characters do whatever the plot needs them to do. It can be a big issue with things like the Black Alert Spore Drive thing. Like, it's just a tool that is used to make the Discovery ship important. The concept behind it is complicated and stupid, and it doesn't have any real backing, and it falls under its own logic. A smaller example of this problem is the spout that Burnham and this guy use when they board the Klingon vessel. This belt device lets them scan as a Klingon life form on the Klingon sensors. When was this invented? Does it only work for Klingons? How does it work? When was it made? Why is it never mentioned in the series again? This is important because this show is set before the original series. And nowhere in the other shows can you ever do this, and this would have been really nice to have in several situations. These TMPs only exist to make the character's life easier, but in doing so, it messes with the canon and integrity of the universe, way worse than Enterprise ever did. I've never been a huge one for canon, right? I don't need everything to be super like, this is how the universe page by page works and all this, alright? But you have to have some consistency, alright? I like it, and if you can please keep it intact, go ahead. But whenever I see crap like this, it just annoys me because it's just lazy writing. That's all it is. In Enterprise and in the show, it's just lazy writing. And this is just season 1. We haven't talked about the time skip to the future and how the Federation barely exists. How all the work that humanity strived for doesn't matter anymore. And how we should all just give up. How there is a red angel from the future, and guess what? That angel is Michael's long dead mother. The show is bad, okay? It has some cool shots, the effects are pretty neat, but overall this show has horrible writing with its characters, and it doesn't care about keeping the canon intact. It doesn't have anything going for it. All of the characters are dislikable. Literally, the only one is Harry Mudd, and you wanna know why I like him? Because he kills all the other characters. Not just once, he kills them a lot, and that was actually pretty fun. That was the one episode. And the entire show, out of all 4 seasons, I only liked one episode.
Do you know how many times I've had the pleasure of taking your life, Lorca? 53, but who's counting? And it never gets old. Oh, drat, we're almost out of time. I'll figure out how that little motor of yours works sooner or later. I've got all the time in the world. And in the meanwhile, we still don't know what this does. Let's find out.
Discovery is a horrible show. It might be the worst show I've ever watched. And I don't like to talk about shows or movies and stuff that I'm not a huge fan of. But this is important because it's affecting how all of Star Trek is viewed upon. Paramount believes that you should be serious and that you should have sci-fi and then, you know, have all this cool technology and these cool effects and these dramatic storylines. And that's what makes a good sci-fi Star Trek show. But that's not what makes Star Trek great. What's never made Star Trek great is the effects. The original series is proof of that. Alright? What makes Star Trek great is the characters and the stories that they're telling and how they can make us as a species better. As I've been saying over and over again, Star Trek is at its best when it's teaching you how to better yourself with new lessons to learn. Even the first two J.J. Abrams Star Trek movies, they are good because of the characters that they have, and they try to push good messages for those characters to learn. The bad movies and the bad shows are when they don't focus on the messages or the characters, and it's just a generic sci-fi show. And it is very sad that a show like this could go so far away from what it was meant to be. Maybe this is what it was originally meant to be. It probably was if it's gone on for 4 seasons. But overall, this show failed at being Star Trek because it didn't care about what made Star Trek. It tried to take the outlying aspects of it and make something weird with it. And that's never been what Star Trek's about. Star Trek is about being good, about bettering yourself, about learning to be a better person for humanity. What can humanity strive to do? And this show totally misses the mark with that. So now that we talked about Discovery, we've gone over about what makes Discovery horrible and why it shouldn't even be called a Star Trek show. We're going to talk about the next show that Paramount made after the failure of the show. And that is Star Trek Picard. So far, the new age of Star Trek isn't going too well. The first two J.J. Abrams movies, while fun, didn't offer more than what was on the surface. Beyond tanked the trilogy with having its characters not learn anything, and Discovery embarrassed the name of Star Trek altogether, by creating a show that didn't represent its core values at all. During this point of the franchise, Star Wars was at a low point. Fans were upset and doubtful. The movies weren't what they were wanting, and the TV shows that had come out didn't have any concepts that were worth recovering. But then, fans got some new news. It was made aware that a new Star Trek TV show was in the works, and this one was starring Patrick Stewart reprising his role as Jean-Luc Picard. The show was called Picard and would be centered about his life after the Enterprise. This show was viewed as the savior of Star Trek to a lot of people. To a good majority of fans, Star Trek hasn't been good since 2009. Even if I enjoy the Abrams movies, I cannot deny that the franchise has been extremely different since 2009. Picard was meant to redeem the harm of the previous parts that had been done. Picard was meant to be a sequel to TNG, to show people a new story with Picard, 7 of 9, Riker, Troy, Data, and a bunch of new characters. And as time got closer, people began to get more excited, until it was released. As I said before, I never watched Picard before this video, and that wasn't entirely true. I had watched the first episode of Picard when it came out, and I decided I was going to wait until it all was out and binge it. But then I was told it sucked, and I didn't want one of my favorite television characters of all time to get ruined, so I avoided it. I avoided any YouTube clips, spoilers, everything. It was actually impressive. But eventually I did decide to watch the show after season 2 came out, and I was told that was an even greater train wreck. And I gotta say, yeah, this show is not great. Picard isn't nearly as offensive as Discovery. The reasoning for this is that it does have elements that are interesting, unique, or funny, but the show doesn't do most of the stuff intentionally. The show is only funny because of the poorly written plots, messy characters, or just confusing situations. Its uniqueness only applies to slim aspects of it, and mystery and interest go out the window by the halfway mark. The show is boring at its best and insulting at its worst. But what is it that drives this frustration? Well, let's start with Picard's plot. Picard is focused on Picard after his life on the Enterprise. The central focus is about the debate between artificial life and organic life. Is it morally alright to keep the machines that we created, and will they rise up and destroy us, or can we work together to build a better society for both? Wow, how original. I've never heard this message before in my life. This thesis is the driving narrative as Picard and his ragtag group of friends make their way trying to rescue an android girl named Soji. Throughout Picard's adventure, he meets 7 of 9 and the other original characters, and they help him throughout his quest. The season ends with Picard inspiring the androids not to summon an evil android god and focus on working together. The end. Oh, and he dies. So the plot of Picard is one of the biggest issues with this series. This plot is focused on the morality of AI life and whether we should work together or not. This premise has been told countless times before, and if you're going to tell it again, you better do it well. And Picard doesn't. It doesn't bring anything new to the table or interesting with this premise. It just treats it as this grand conversation, but the truth is, if you're talking about this message that has already been talked about so many times, what's different about you? What separates you from the rest? And Picard, there's nothing. The worst part about this is that this premise has already been told in Star Trek before. This premise was a 1-episode issue in TNG where Data is being questioned about if he is considered a life form.
A single Data, and forgive me, Commander, is a curiosity. A wonder even, but thousands of Datas. Isn't that becoming a race? And won't we be judged by how we treat that race? Now tell me, Commander, what is Data? I don't understand. What is he? A machine. Is he? Are you sure? Yes. You see, he's met 2 of your 3 criteria for sentience, so what if he meets the 3rd? Consciousness in even the smallest degree. What is he then? I don't know. Do you?
It's one of the best episodes in the series to me, and it is a quick, concise, and efficient episode. Picard feels like they took plots of different TNG episodes and stretched it out over the course of 10 hours. This leads into the next issue. The show does not justify its long runtime. The show is long and it has too many characters. For a show that has 10 hours of content, only 2 hours of it actually feels relevant. Most of the show is focused on Picard recruiting people, getting yelled at, or fight scenes to stretch out the time. The show has a lot of action and a lot of repetitive dialogue that makes it feel redundant. Entire scenes can actually just have no purpose, which can be extremely frustrating. And this feeling of fluff and extra scenes is enforced with the amount of characters in this show. Because this show has a lot of characters, and most of them are not helpful. You got discount Han Solo, you got generic gay grandma, generic tough gay girl, Legolas, and an annoying blonde girl. These characters all have large portions of screen time, and they actually have very little to do in the story. Blonde girl and grandma have actually effects in the story, while the rest are mostly just for the ride. Having a lot of characters can be impactful and great. West Wing and Star Trek shows are proof of this. But the reason why it succeeds in those shows is because of the episodic format and how it handles them. Every episode focuses on a different character a little more than the others, which allows them to swap the characters they need for those situations, giving you time to learn, grow, and know these people. Data and Geordi could have a focus episode, and maybe Worf and Riker have a different one. This balance allows the show to go through different characters, see how they react in different situations, and makes the show feel more real. In Picard, the show is focused on one central narrative, which focuses on the need of the plot. You may have only needed the Han Solo ripoff character for the first 2 episodes of the show, but then what does he do after that? Pretty much nothing. If you're going to write the character out of the story, then you have to have a reason for him to be there. And if you're just trying to find reasons for the character to be in your story, well, maybe he shouldn't be there at all. This applies to many of the characters in this show, and it causes you to feel like you're wasting your time. This is apparent when you get to characters like Riker and Troy, who have the best episode in the show. Picard and Soji are hiding out at Riker's house, and it's relaxing and fun. It's calming, and you really enjoy this relaxing environment. But the problem is that this scene makes little sense in the context of the show. It's similar to the farm scene in Age of Ultron, when the Avengers just go to Clint's house and just stay there for no real reason. It feels like they just put these characters in the show because we like these characters and we know them, and we don't have to spend screen time on them to know who they are. The show doesn't centralize on this or build it naturally. The entire show feels like it pulls the brakes and just stops what it is doing, and it's very jarring as an audience viewer. And speaking of characters of Troy and Riker, let's talk about legacy characters in this show. Riker and Troy are fun, and they're fine. They will represent what I wanted with them in a calming way, but even they are jarring in the show because of how they're just shoved in it. Characters like 7 and 9 aren't actually well developed in the show because they took any interest she really had in Voyager and turned her into a plucky, tomboy, badass alcoholic. It's jarring and it doesn't feel consistent. It feels like they're trying to use the name of certain characters to bring in the audience, but not actually staying true to who those characters are, because the story they wrote wouldn't require that character to be there, but it would be really cool if we could have that character be here. So if we just change who they are just a little bit so that they're a different person but with the same name and different personality, then yeah, it'll be great, right? And no, the Picard is just full of stuff like this, and Picard as a main character is the most obvious part. For the most part, he is a background character in his own show, acting feeble and belittle to anyone who disagrees with him. He doesn't stand up for himself or act like someone who would have commanded a starship. Instead, he feels like a man who played it safe. He feels like someone who got beat down in life and took it, someone who got pushed to the ground and stayed down instead of getting up. Picard was a man who stood up for morals that he believed in. He was a representation of what every man should strive to be. He's up there along with Aragorn as one of the peak role models for what a man should be, in my opinion. And this show is very distant from who he is in TNG. For the most part, it's annoying. Picard gets bullied and kind of just accepts it. It's a little annoying, but it isn't until the last 2 episodes that this is an extreme issue. These episodes really focus on the conflict for Soji. Does she listen to Picard, who is telling her to be nice and not to kill people, or does she listen to her robot family, who wants to murder the galaxy? And this conflict is tough for Soji, for some reason. But in the end, she has a change of heart and chooses to side with Picard. Not before we see some alien robot octopus arms. Great, we have Cthulhu in Star Trek now. The episode ends with Picard having a type of seizure and he pretty much dies. And here we get a scene that is a ripoff from Harry Potter and Dumbledore after Harry dies. Picard is talking to Data and they're talking about their life and their kind of regrets. But then we get to a point where Data tells Picard that he isn't going to stay dead and how he's about to return. And here, Data tells Picard to let him die. That Data is tired of living and he wants to experience death. And so Picard wakes up and he is in an android body. He looks like Picard, talks like Picard, and is going to die around the same time as Picard and all that, but he's really just an android. So yeah, the show ends with Picard dying and a robot that looks like him is taking his place. I'm not going to go into why this is frustrating in depth because for the most part I feel like it is self-evident. Picard is a man who always focused on living his life to the fullest and being the best person he could be. But in this show he doesn't know what that means. He acts like the version of himself in TNG that didn't learn to live his life. It's really quite shocking. The show doesn't feel like Star Trek. Like Discovery, it misunderstands what it is meant to be. The show is set in a time where it feels like we are now, just with better technology. People are cursing, vaping, have media news, and more. It really just feels like our time, but with better technology. But Star Trek is a series that looks at an optimistic future for humanity. Look what happens when we put aside our differences and work together. What we achieve when we look to the stars. It's optimistic, but Picard feels dark and gritty. It feels chaotic and frustrating. People talk about shooting themselves. You see people kill themselves. There's media, there's cursing, disrespect, and more permeating throughout this show, and it is very frustrating. This isn't why I watch Star Trek. The final thing that Picard fails at is something that no one really warned me about, and I'm going to go into it because I actually don't see a lot of people talking about this, and it is the editing. Editing is something where it is extremely important because done well, you can have a great positive influence on a project. Mediocre, it doesn't improve or really hurt it, it's just telling a story. But bad editing can make a show extremely annoying to watch. Picard is a show that feels like it has reshoots. It's hard to explain, but you'll have to just kind of watch it to see. But I don't want you to do that, so I'm just going to try my best to describe it to you. Because it feels like the scenes are out of order. Like, for instance, there's a scene where Picard is on the Borg cube, and him and Soji are trying to escape. But they're about to be pinned down by these Romulans until Legolas arrives and slices and dices them. And you're like, oh wow, I thought he was on the ship, right? And then it cuts to the ship and the crew members, and they're like, wait, has anyone seen Legolas? That's not how you edit that together. The scenes should flow from one into the other. The crew should have been wondering where Legolas was, and then we should see where he went, so the audience member can follow along the story. You don't try to trick your audience, it's just frustrating and stupid. There's many times in the show where this is how it feels. You really just have to watch it, but take my word for it. In the end, Picard is in the same boat as Discovery. It's not as offensive, but it is still pretty bad. It feels like someone watched TNG and wanted to make weird edgelord fan fiction with it. It's crazy. And this is the lowest we've been, guys. We've had Discovery, and then Picard, and they're all extremely foreign to the Star Trek brand. Even the worst Star Trek shows before were miles ahead of these, because no matter what they did, they still kept the integrity of Star Trek together. These shows don't. These shows feel like they were written for a completely different audience, and judging by the reaction, it isn't going well. So after a long, grueling 8 years of Beyond, Discovery, Picard, we're just left wondering, what now? A lot of people truly believe that the franchise is dead, gone so far from what it was meant to be.
Basically what I'm saying here is that I'm fucking done with Star Trek. I just don't give a shit about it anymore, because let's be honest here, Star Trek isn't even Star Trek anymore, and it hasn't been for a long time. Since about 2009 by my reckoning.
This video really should end, but we actually have one more show to talk about that really is kind of a weird thing for Star Trek. And that is Lower Decks. Lower Decks is kind of weird when it comes to just Star Trek in general. Like, of all the shows to expect from Star Trek, this was one that I did not expect. A Rick and Morty animated style show told in a comedic format by lower level officers. The show would be focused on a group of diverse and punky group of characters, which kind of worried me. The trailers did not set this show up for success, and the show had me worried that it would pander to certain groups and audiences instead of just telling a good story. Everything seemed to be that way, and while the first season had some of my fears, the majority of them were put to rest when season 2 rolled out. Lower Decks is a pretty funny show that actually holds a lot of the original values. It's comedic and tells pretty good stories, but it has a group of tightly knit characters who all, for the most part, are likable. Seeing them make fun of the bridge crew, the crazy things that happen, or just breaking the fourth wall in subtle ways is fun and entertaining. Because no matter what, how many times the show does this, it focuses on two things: keeping the characters growing and not compromising the story for comedic purposes. The story and characters are always at the forefront of this show, and it makes this show what it is. A relaxing comedic show that allows the characters to be who they are in situations that are quite ridiculous. I didn't say it in my Discovery review, but Michael Burnham is a lot like Beckett Mariner, except she doesn't learn. The reason why people like and tolerate Beckett is because while she acts like a college student, she is one of the more lowest ranking members of a starship. Not just any starship, but a starship that for the majority of the time doesn't matter. Beckett is a loser, and she learns to become someone who isn't petty, and that's why we like her, because she learns as a real person. We can all relate to Beckett. We see her grow as a person, her struggle and fears are real, and while I don't like her 100% of the time, the majority of the show she is learning and living her life, and it makes her extremely relatable. Now look at Burnham, who is cocky, arrogant, and has similar traits to Beckett, except she's on an extremely important vessel. She's a first officer, she was raised by Vulcans to be extremely logical, and is supposed to be extremely smart. She's supposed to be a mature person. Her status, background, and position all say that this is someone who knows what she's doing, but she doesn't. Not only that, but she refuses to learn and grow, and she stays the same as the same old person, and it's frustrating. Beckett isn't the only good character in the show, though. Boimler and the other side characters are lovely to watch, and to see them all work as a group is really fun. The show didn't really seem to know what to do with them in Season 1, but by Season 2, the show was in full stride. The show had realized its strength, which was with its core cast, and not as much with Beckett, and when that was realized, we stopped getting overwhelmed with just Beckett, and began to experience the whole cast, and this actually allowed more time to flesh out Beckett and some of the other characters, instead of only Beckett, who felt like it could be redundant at times. Now, Lower Decks isn't the most fleshed out Star Trek show that we've had, and it isn't the greatest of all time by any means. In a lot of ways, a lot of people don't even consider it when they're talking about Star Trek. But to me, this show understands more than the previous two TV shows what Star Trek really is. It is adventurous, it is silly, it being a comedy allows it to tell a Star Trek show in a different way, which I appreciate. It's cool to have different varieties of things to tell Star Trek stories in. So I think Lower Decks is a lot going for it, but the only thing is it's because of this style that they have decided to go with. They don't focus on the more really deep, meaningful conversations as much. Now, as I was recording this, Lower Decks Season 3 is not out, so this is basically just over Season 1 and 2. But in the end, Lower Decks is surprisingly good. It's nothing to write home about, but it is an enjoyable little show that is quite harmless in the grand scheme of things.
Hey, Bradward. Want to test the sweetness of my bushel?
Ugh, fine, Genevieve. Just give it 43 more sun hours at 21 degrees bricks.
Oh, okay.
Forever.
Bradward, all these varietals are so confusing. Take me to the privacy of the Pickery shed and explain them to me.
Come on, Mandolina. Red goes in the red bucket, white in the white. You know that. How do they not see this as a setup?
And it is quite crazy that this show, a more push to the side show, is inherently more proud of its roots and more happy to be Star Trek than the other two shows, Picard and Discovery. And that is very, very sad. And while this show is fun, though, it isn't enough to keep this franchise afloat. So after everything that's happened, we've reached the end of the most current Star Trek shows. Picard had Season 3 come out, Discovery's fourth and final season ended with the lowest rating out of all of the seasons. You had a kids show that no one was really going to watch, and they were pumping another show called Strange New Worlds out. And from here, we were all done. People had given up on what this franchise really meant, and the only comfort they found was in the solitude of an older show. We unsubscribed to Paramount Plus and went to bed never to awake. And as for me, I began to write this video, sad in the knowledge that I didn't think I'd find a show that reminded me of what Star Trek used to be. A show that would break me from my slumber and show me that perhaps there was hope, that perhaps there were dedicated individuals trying to make good Star Trek content. Star Trek content that would remind me of potential of mankind and show men what it meant to really live my life. But sadly, a show like this wasn't out. And then something happened. So, fun fact, this video was actually supposed to end here, looking back at the last 13 years and finalizing the differences between the golden era and this new one that we're in. How these Star Trek shows aren't what Star Trek is about, and how right now we're not where we need to be. I wanted to be hopeful about the future, but wasn't sure if that was fair, since everything we've gotten since 2009 hasn't really felt like Star Trek. That is, until this new show, Strange New Worlds, came out. Strange New Worlds didn't catch my eye when I first heard of it. In fact, I didn't even know it was coming out 2 weeks until it was released on Paramount Plus. The trailers weren't particularly engaging, and it certainly didn't release any doubt I had about it. Paramount had proven time and time again that they didn't know what to do with the Star Trek content that they had, so why would this time be any different? And to top it off, the show was a spin-off from Discovery. And we know how I feel about that show. And while Pike and his crew were some of the best parts about Discovery, besides Harry Mudd, I still didn't exactly like his involvement in that story. So overall, I was not excited about this show, and it released and I didn't pay too much attention to it until around 3 days after it was released, and I wandered on Paramount Plus and I was like, fine, I'll try it. And I gotta say, this show surprised me. Like, I was actually shocked after watching the first episode. I'm going to explain, and I'm also going to spoil just the first episode of this show. Nothing else. This pilot introduces us to Pike and what he's currently doing after the events of Discovery. He's depressed after seeing a vision of himself dying and spends most of the episode contemplating it and trying to figure out how he's going to handle it. The Enterprise is under a maintenance check and has a week left, but after being told that the first officer of the Enterprise has been kidnapped, Pike sets out with Spock and the rest of the crew to rescue them. Pike also gets a first officer named Laan Singh. Pike and Enterprise find where the first officer is taken. Pike, Spock, and Singh disguise themselves among the natives, and they realize that this planet is very similar to Earth in 2022. Pike and the rest of the crew save the first officer. The first officer and Singh turn out to be old friends, and they escape with just a brief tussle. The end. Now, this episode is pretty good. It's fun. You see Pike's perspective and how he handles this knowledge he has. You also get good characterization for Spock and Singh. Singh is developed extremely well and is fun to watch as the show goes on. The episode has a basic pilot, but nothing special, until the third act. Remember how I say they escape and that's the end of the episode? Well, I actually lied. Pike and the rest rescued the first officer, and they're about to have the Enterprise beam them up when Pike finds out that the natives of this planet got technology from Star Trek. They saw the Enterprise and were making weapons that they shouldn't because it was too advanced for them at this time. But with the knowledge of the Enterprise, they were able to gather enough information to start building these weapons. And when Pike learns of this, he has the rest escape except for him and Spock, and they surrender themselves to the natives.
Take me to your leader.
Here, Pike gives a speech about how the natives should not use their weapons for evil, and how they should use it for good. When they reject, we get this awesome scene where Pike has the Enterprise come into orbit and show the people of the planet that he's really the guy in charge of the situation.
Just like you said, whoever has the biggest stick wins. In this case, that is me.
Afterwards, he has the world leaders meet and they argue for a few hours, and then he gives a great speech about how Earth used to be similar and how if they're not careful, they're going to destroy themselves. He then offers them to join the Federation, and they do. The world leaders choose peace and decide to use the technology that they acquired to explore the stars. It's amazing. This is what I've been looking for 13 years. For 13 years, I've waited for a captain to solve the conflict with not violence, but with words and diplomacy. It was so refreshing to watch this after all the garbage I watched for this video. And then afterwards, the episode wraps everything together with a neat bow, with this solid message of acceptance and trust. Sean neglected to tell Pike about her friendship with the first officer because she was afraid he wouldn't let her come aboard the await team. Pike remarks on how she didn't trust him to trust her, and how Starfleet's biggest strength is working together. Sean tells him how trusting people is a struggle of hers. And then, Pike gives one of the best speeches in Star Trek since 2009. I can't play it, but he explains how there was a species of animal that they preserved in space during World War III, and how after the war, they had multiplied too much. So Starfleet built these domes in space to preserve them. Even in space, growth. Starfleet worked together to preserve these creatures and how they're thriving. He then offers Singh to join the Enterprise, and the episode ends with them on their 5-year journey. This is amazing. This episode had Pike inspire a civilization to work together and to trust one another, and then he teaches the same lesson to one of his crew members and inspires them to take up the arms and to work with him to make a better tomorrow. This is what Star Trek is about: teaching lessons, bettering ourselves, learning from our mistakes, inspiring others, a positive look on humanity. Pike is a great captain, and he's someone who inspires others, but is also commanding.
I'm only gonna tell you this once. Get the hell out of my chair.
He's a fantastic character in this show, and pretty much every other character is as well. Spock gets a surprising amount of character growth in this show. Uhura, number 1, Christine Chapel, and more all learn great lessons throughout this show. I'm not going to spoil this show because I sincerely believe you should go experience it for yourself. The last 3 episodes of the show are my favorite episodes of the whole show, and they're great. The show isn't revolutionary with its message, and at times it can be quite simple, but it's taking steps, it's tackling messages that should be talked about, it's explaining morality, it feels real, and it handles its plot threads wonderfully. Also, the show is extremely episodic, even having commercial breaks, editing, and more that makes it feel more reminiscent to TNG and the original series. Strange New Worlds so far is the best Star Trek we've gotten since Deep Space Nine. It's refreshing and fun, and I'm so happy. The show understands what people want from Star Trek. The fans reacted well to it, the critics enjoy it, and while the show isn't perfect, it's fun and has massive improvements over what we've seen before. And I gotta say, this show has a finale that took balls. This finale actually shocked me. So now that I have overhyped this show, I hope you go watch it. This show is great, and I'm so happy to end this video on a positive note. And yes, we should probably wait to really judge Strange New Worlds until more seasons come out. But so far, this first season was so refreshing and so enjoyable that I have to talk well about it, because I need people to know that this is good. They need to know that they did something right here, and this is what they need to keep making. I thought I was going to have to end this video talking about how Paramount doesn't know its audience and how we as a fandom might be lost for a long time. But I don't have to do that anymore. Paramount still has a lot of crap to figure out, like still releasing Season 3 of Picard is not good. But having Stranger Worlds helps me believe that there may be more good Star Trek content in the future. And even if the future seasons are bad and we don't get a good show or movie again, I'm glad that for the first time in a long time, I got to experience what it was like watching Star Trek again. I got to immerse myself in a show where we learned to better ourselves, where humanity's technology didn't just take advance, but so did our mind and our motivations and our morals. We learned to become better. How to solve our problems with words and thoughts instead of our fists, where political interests take a backseat and exploring takes a priority. For the first time in a while, I got to experience a piece of my childhood again, and that meant a lot. Star Trek is a franchise that deserves to be treated well, because in the end, it's a franchise that isn't like many others. It's fun action-adventure drama series with methodical characters and interesting plots. It always stood apart from the rest. I remember when I was a kid, people who would ask me certain things like, do you prefer Star Wars or Star Trek? And I couldn't compare them because, to me, these are two completely different genres. One is a fantasy and one is a sci-fi. One is traditional action-adventure show and one is a political drama. They're two completely different stories that both have star in the title. And I love both. You know, I'm really glad I got to end this video with a positive ending, because I've preached this entire video about how Star Trek is an optimistic look into the future, and to end this video with an optimistic look at what is to come feels right. Star Trek is a franchise that has changed in many ways. It's gone from good to great, to different, to unrecognizable. The franchise has changed from its roots of a better humanity to just traditional sci-fi. The goals of bettering humanity were replaced with action, cussing, and bad characters. But even through all this rubble and debris, there is still a light ahead. The golden era of Star Trek may be behind us, but the future is still what we make of it. We still can make a difference for Star Trek. So let Paramount know that, hey, Lower Decks and Strange New Worlds, those are the Star Trek that we want in the future. Don't accept the bad shows that we get. Don't accept Picard Season 1, Season 2, Season 3. Don't accept all of Discovery. Accept what is Star Trek. Accept what makes you have fun. What makes you see a positive look. Accept Star Trek. Like I said, the golden era may be behind us, but we can make the difference. And that is what happened to Star Trek.